Okay, good evening, everyone. And as you can see, coming to you not from my office today, but in fact, I'm at home. The reason that I'm at home is because today I went and got my first COVID vaccination. And it just seemed like might be better not to be out so late and driving home. So that's why I asked permission from the department to be able to come to you from home today. So I hope that everything will be working okay. Do let me know if there's any problems at all that as far as what you can see and what you can hear. And I'll just I think everything should be okay. I think I do have a quite a good connection here, and should be able to come to you quite all right. I'm feeling fine, a bit tired. I guess that's typical for getting the vaccination, the day you get the vaccination. But otherwise fine. And just to immediately remind you that this week your commentary is due, all right? Minimum 800 words, all right? Don't give me less than that. Otherwise, you will be getting less of a grade, all right? So please be sure to give the 800 words minimum. I think that should not be difficult to do. Excuse me. And I hope that today, if you have any questions, I mean, I imagine most of you probably, if not done already, are quite close to being done. So, but if you still have any outstanding questions, do let me know, okay? And today I thought that we'll do a few things, but in some respects, we're going to be also somewhat reviewing, as we have been doing. We're going to continue with taking some examples from past exams, and to give you sort of a feel, again, for what you can expect, so that when you sit down for the exam, and by the way, I wasn't aware until I was informed by one of your classmates that the notice had gone out about it being face-to-face, in-person exams, not online, except if you are outside of Hong Kong. And that I hadn't been aware of, but then was made aware of that, and found out that that indeed was the case. And that if you wanted to do the online, it should be because you are outside Hong Kong. The expectation being that if you are in Hong Kong, you will come and do the exam in person. Now, if there's any sort of mitigating reason, and you were supposed to have indicated this by the 10th of April. So in fact, it's already past the time for you to indicate otherwise. I hope that you've all received that notice and saw that notice. In any case, if there is a reason why you, even though you're in Hong Kong, you cannot do it online. You have you feel you have a very good reason, you can apply for mitigation, okay? And if you have a question about how to do that, the general office would be glad to give you the necessary procedure for you to follow. It is a formal procedure. You do have to do it, complete it in writing and so forth, explain your reasons. But if that is the case, then I would encourage you to follow through on that point, all right? If you are outside Hong Kong, and if you have not indicated that you wish to do it online, well, then please do that as soon as possible. You really were supposed to have done it by the 10th, but I'm just wanting to make sure that you all were well aware of what was going on, and that whatever your situation, you have dealt with it as appropriate. All right, so the online is supposed to, again, be for only those who are outside Hong Kong. If you're in Hong Kong, you're supposed to do it face to face. You were supposed to have indicated which way by the 10th. It's past that time, but if you say weren't aware of the notice, if the situation is that you are outside Hong Kong and cannot do it in person, then important that you do let me know, email me as immediately, all right? Don't wait, that needs to be done. On the other hand, if you, again, are in Hong Kong and you really feel you have very valid reasons, apply then for mitigation. And again, the general office from the Linguistics and Translation Department can give you the necessary advice. So I hope that you're all well aware of that, okay? So the exam, what will you expect? You'll expect it to be in 2 sections. The first section will count for 60%. And exactly the nature of the what you'll be required to do will be as I've been giving you examples. Good question. Just came up on chat. Will we be able to use the electronic devices during the face-to-face exam? Good question. Again, I'm before I answer that, I have to check myself whether that will be, whether online, I mean face-to-face, in person means you're there with your notebook and doing it in class with your notebook, online in a way, but in person. Now, that's how it was in the last semester. Will that be the case this time? That, again, I have to check on that. That's a very good question, and I'll check on that. And the date for the exam, yes, I'll again check on that. I have what I believe is the date, and I think it's been confirmed. But again, let me make sure that the dates are actually confirmed by the registrar's office. I know that there was a plan in terms of dates and so forth, whether that was actually confirmed. So again, for both of these questions, will we be able to use electronic devices? I'll have to check. And what about the date for the exam? During the break, I'll check what was the tentative date. All right, and I believe that should be confirmed. And so during the break, I'll check and then give that information to you after the break. Okay. All right. As you can see, I've got my phone in front of me, so I can see your chats. And if there is any question as we're going through this, this is week 12, and we only have one more week before we're concluding. All right, so we are getting round to the end of the semester, and I know your thoughts go to the exam and the final assignment and things like that. I know I was a student once myself, so I know that's sort of where you're probably thinking. One point that I do want to make, and I because I feel this strongly, and that is that when we're going through these sort of mock tests. It's not just sort of practice tests. It really is, I think, a learning process too. And I've said this to you before. I think treat it as a way, a learning process. One of your classmates was asking me when you're doing the commentary, for example, are you sort of following the same way like you're doing like our practice exam, this section A? Are you doing that for the commentary? My response was, and I sent that to all of you also and copied that to all of you, is yes. I mean, whatever text you're analyzing, you're looking for what there is in the lexical grammar that, and thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. So you're thinking grammatically. And what we've done in order to be able to look at a text grammatically has been to identify some steps that we can take to analyze a text. And the ways that we've been analyzing it are the way that you see in terms of the mock exam, the section A. You get an analysis, a set of tables. And the tables, what do they represent? They represent the analysis of that text in terms of transitivity, in terms of theme, in terms of logical. And so that's what you're doing here for these texts that will be like on the exam. But it's also the way that we've been analyzing poetry. It's the way that we've been analyzing academic texts, speeches, any text. And that was the point that Halliday made, and that was that we need to have you remember his word for it? Grammatics. Doesn't use the word linguistics, he says grammatics. And in other words, a way to think grammatically, a method, an approach, which we can then apply to whatever kind of text, so that we don't end up just sort of ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary, as Halliday put it. We don't do that. We're instead wanting to have a method, an approach that we can apply to any kind of text. And because we have the same because we're applying the same method, that means that in fact, what we're doing is we have a way to compare texts. Now, when you take a look at a text, now like this, section A, I'll read it first. See the attached data tables for transitivity, logical, and theme ream analyses. From the systemic functional analysis of the closing statement of the Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney in the third debate with US President Obama. Okay, it sets the setting. And it gives you the lexicogrammatical analysis. What are you looking for? You're taking those tables which represent your data. You're looking for patterns within the data. You're looking for repetitions within the data. You're looking for where a particular usage, grammatical usage, a particular theme or tense or use of a process type or a logical pattern, parataxis or hypotaxis, where that occurs in the text. And do you observe something that you can say sort of describes that text, that explains how that text makes meaning? Now, you have to see, though, any text analyzed, yes, transitivity, logical, theme ream, you have to see that text within the context. within the context of situation within which that text appears. So when you see, for example, now depending on the nature of the text that will be on your exam, you need to go back and you need to look in your experience over this past semester or before. What are the expectations that you have for that text? What have you observed about other texts of similar nature occurring in a similar situation? In this case, we did analyses in class of political speeches. Specifically, we looked at this debate. You know, this was an actual question on one exam. And I was so surprised when I was going through the students' answers and their submissions for the exam. I was so surprised that quite a few, did not even mention what other data we had we compared Mitt Romney with Obama. And that was something that had been discussed in lecture. And all that information, all those tables and everything that looked at how Obama handled that debate. And we compared Obama's performance in one debate in the first and then in the last, remember? And that was in the lecture material. And I was so expecting that students would, of course, go back into their lecture notes and get that information and then be bringing that to their answer here, because you're comparing it with what you know already. And yet some acted like, you know, there was nothing that they could compare it with. So when depending on the nature of the text, again, I'll repeat that, depending on the nature of the text, because I'm not telling you, you don't know what text it will be. So that's why I've been telling you all along to go through and categorize your material. Look at what were the kinds of texts that we've analyzed over the course of this past semester. We've looked at, as I said, political speeches. We looked at this debate performance. We've looked at poetry, of course. We've looked at academic writing. We've looked at speeches, commencement speeches. I'll say a bit more about that later. Motivational speeches. We've looked at quite a few kinds of texts. Now, when you then have a text on your exam, first thing to do is to go back and look at what do you know about texts that occur within that situation. And that is the basis on which you are then going to apply and compare and have certain hypotheses in mind about what this text should be like. Oh, on chat, I received a message from one of your classmates that the exam is on the 12th of May. And as from my recollection, that should be correct. I will, as I said, during the break, I'll go back to compare, all right? Okay, so come back to the question then. What patterns do you observe in this text? Patterns, looking for patterns. The next question, how has fit to context likely influenced the patterning you observe here in this text? So the main thing is, don't just give me tables. Don't just tell me, oh, there is more parataxis than hypotaxis. Oh, there's a lot of There's so many percentage of material processes, so many percentage of mental processes, so many relational processes, and give me those sort of quantities, those sums, all right? That, yeah, will be part of your answer, but that's not it. You're then taking that and making observations about why it fits that nature. For example, when we went back and we looked at speeches of Obama, Trump, Nixon, we observed certain things about their use of parataxis, hypotaxis. We found that all three of them, in fact, there were occasions when, for example, they gave speeches where there was far more hypotaxis than parataxis. But sometimes, Nixon's departure speech, remember, a lot more parataxis. Why? Because he was delivering it without, it wasn't prepared, it wasn't written out, it was on the spot, spoken. What patterns do you observe in this text? How has fit to context likely influenced the patterning you observe here in this text? So fit it to the context. Look at the text in the context in which it occurs. With reference to the discussion in class about Obama's performance in the same debate, compare Romney's performance with Obama's and discuss how his use of language may have contributed to the response of those watching the debate. Compare. Remember, again, I want to go back to that point that Halliday was making. He's saying that we need to have a grammatics that will allow us to compare texts for their aesthetic and functional values. So what patterns do you observe in this text? How has fit to context likely influenced the patterning that you observe here in this text? Make sure you answer both of these questions. All right, so again, if you had that text on your exam, you of course would go back to where we discussed the Obama versus Romney debates. And we already indicated, and I gave you information, this was important information about how people responded to these debates. Now, that is an aspect of meaning. How do people respond? How do they value? Why does that text have the value that it does? Why does it win someone's support in this kind of political contest? What gives it that value? And that's a functional value. What is if you're looking at a spoken word performance, like what you're doing with Brandon Leake's spoken word performance, his poem, you're looking at the aesthetic value. Why did people respond to it so favorably? There's something about that text that isn't just its functional value, it's aesthetic value. What gave it that aesthetic value? And that for your commentary means that you need to go beyond looking at the patterning to looking at the repatterning, to observing how that patterning forms a background against which the theme is being foregrounded. Of course, we made observations about the first presidential debate, and Obama not doing very well and Romney doing much better. And in the third debate, Obama did better. For the CBS News poll, way better. The CNN poll was closer tie. All right.
Thank you, Bob, Mr. President, folks at Lynn University. Good to be with you. I'm optimistic about the future. I'm excited about our prospects as a nation. I want to see peace. I want to see growing peace in this country. It's our objective. We have an opportunity to have real leadership. America is going to have that kind of leadership and continue to promote principles of peace that will make a world a safer place and make people in this country more confident that their future is secure. I also want to make sure that we get this economy going. And there are two very different paths the country can take. One is a path represented by the president, which at the end of 4 years would mean we'd have $20 trillion in debt, heading towards Greece. I'll get us on track to a balanced budget. The president's path will mean continuing declining in take-home pay. I want to make sure our take-home pay turns around and starts to grow. The president's path means 20 million people out of work, struggling for a good job. I'll get people back to work with 12 million new jobs. I'm going to make sure that we get people off of food stamps, not by cutting the program, but by getting them good jobs. America's going to come back, and for that to happen, we're going to have a president who can work across the aisle. I was in a state where my legislature was 87% Democrat. I learned how to get along on the other side of the aisle. We've got to do that in Washington. Washington is broken. I know what it takes to get this country back, and we'll work with good Democrats and good Republicans to do that. This nation is the hope of the earth. We've been blessed by having a nation that's free and prosperous thanks to the contributions of the greatest generation. They've held a torch for the world to see, a torch of freedom and hope and opportunity. Now it's our turn to take that torch. I'm convinced we'll do it. We need strong leadership. I'd like to be that leader with your support. I'll work with you. I'll lead you in an open and honest way. And I ask for your vote. I'd like to be the next president of the United States to support and help this great nation and to make sure that we all together maintain America as the hope of the earth. Thank you so much.
All right, now that was the text. And definitely, first thing you do is read the text that you're analyzing. Don't just launch into the tables. Look at the text. Read through the text. What is the text? What is the nature of the text? That is what you should then be addressing. Frame the text within the context of situation. And having done so, you ask yourself, what are your expectations? Given typical features of text occurring in context of situation, what do you expect in this speech? It's a debate performance. And what is his purpose? His purpose is to persuade people to vote for him. He's trying to motivate people to vote for him. How is he trying to motivate people to vote for him? By what he's saying he'll accomplish. He's not the president. He wants to be the president. And so for him, it's not going to be like Obama. Obama was to defend his performance. For Romney, it is to discuss what he intends to do, what he wants to do, what he'd like to do. And you must have noticed that phrasing continuously coming through. That's why I say, you already begin to get an impression as you look at the text, as you read the text. It is what he wants to accomplish. It is future-oriented, because that's all he can say. He's not the president. He can't speak much to his performance. Yes, he says some things about his performance in terms of previous roles, but certainly not as president. So frame the text within the context of situation. Then take a look at transitivity. By now, this should be so well understood. What is transitivity? The process types. What material, mental, verbal, relational, behavioral, existential, what processes? Who or what are in the ER roles? Who are the initiators? Who is the affected? I didn't ask that here, but that's an obvious question. All right, so we take a look at the transitivity table. Now, I'd given this information to you before. I hope you took a look at it and made some observations about what you see. There's a lot of doing, and you'll notice that there's a lot of make, get, going, get, these kinds of verbs that again are related to this idea of what he hopes to accomplish, what he hopes to carry out, the actions not that have been taken, but that he looks forward to taking. And as we go through the text and we take a look at it, certainly we could compile a list of the process types. And the other thing would be to look at the use of I and what is I doing. But what really struck me so much as I went through it, and if I were you, if you're going to be doing this and you have the paper in front of you, in some cases, in some ways, I think it's easier when it's sort of hard copy there in front of you, because I would underline, I would use some other color pen to try to notice what is sort of something that I observe. I want to see America's going to have, continue to promote, that'll make, future. It's also future oriented, a very positive future. Is very much what he wants to accomplish. It is his desire. It's what he wants to do. I want to make sure that we get this economy going. And then he compares the president. The president's path will mean this. He compares his performance with what he's saying the president's path. Notice he doesn't say the president, but he says the president's path. The president's path. So it doesn't make it a more or less a conflict with the person, as with his intention, as opposed to the president's intention. And this continues throughout the speech. One pattern that you cannot help but notice is this: I want to, I'd like to, and the future, and the use of the future. We'll do it. We'll work. And so it's not just what I want to do and what he'd like to do. It is what we will do, what we will accomplish. We will work. We will do it. I'll work with you, he says. And so it is this use of I, this use of we, but all very much future oriented. Okay, I go on to the logical. I'm looking at simple versus complex, parataxis versus hypotaxis. What do I expect to find? Well, as I look at this and I sort of tabulate and add up, I'm taking a look at, in terms of simple versus complex, I notice it's almost 50-50. There's quite a few simple clauses here. Parataxis versus hypotaxis, 82%. Well, that is typical of sort of presidential speeches. And then presidential speeches that have been the most well received, all right? From whether it's Obama, whether it's Nixon, and even for Trump, what was considered presidential was when he gave that speech to Congress, and it again had primarily hypotactic rather than paratactic. Theme. Now, this is something that we've already seen somewhat in transitivity, the role of I, the role of we. But here we can begin to see also the use of I, the use of we in theme position. We notice quite a lot of and. Now, the and, again, accounts for that paratactic. Not as great, of course, as hypotactic, but and that conjunction that is creating that parataxis is that simplest of all conjunctions, and we had that table that when we talked about it, and we saw that I, first person, as theme, 38%. Comparing with Obama and Obama's third debate, 35%, almost the same. And we, again, a little bit less than Obama, but again, the emphasis was there. And other things, 38%. So we saw that pretty much Obama and Romney were quite similar in terms of their use of I and we throughout their closing statement. Because why the I? Remember, Trump was criticized because of all of the first person reference. And here it's quite high, but it's in that giving that closing statement in the debate where one is, in fact, trying to make the case for why they should be elected. It is about themselves. It is about why you should elect them and what. So of course it will be more first person than if they were giving a speech to Congress or giving a speech otherwise. But this is a debate. And the purpose of the debate is to motivate people to vote for them. And they then have to make a case for why they are the better candidate. It does come down to the first person, I. But of course, it can't just be about I. It also has to be about them as president working with the people to accomplish what they want to accomplish, what he wants to accomplish. Now, that is, you are going to have an hour basically to work on this. And that's what I would plan on when you're doing your exam. Plan on the first hour, you're doing this analysis, this section A. Even though it's 60%, still, I would count on an hour and devote an hour to it, and then go on to do the essay. And if you still have time, come back to if you have something more to say about the text that you're working on. That's the strategy I would recommend. First thing you do in section A is you read the text. Second, frame it within the context of situation within which it takes place. Compare it with other texts, the patterning that you identify in other texts of the same sort of context of situation. On that basis, what are your expectations? What do you expect to see in this text? What should you see in this text? Your hypotheses, your expectations for what the nature of the text should be like, given what you know about texts, based on what we have studied and what we have done over the past semester. And then look at the tables, draw out some sort of patterning in terms of the use of tense, the use of process type, the use of who is in what role, what is theme, what are the nature of the conjunctions used, what are the logical the logical relations that are being used within the text. And on that basis, what can you say? What gives that text sort of an identity in terms of the patterning that occurs within that text? That's how you should be approaching this. Question was on the chat was, do compound clauses belong to simple or complex? If we go back, let me just take you back here. What would be a compound sentence? Compound sentence would be where you have two clauses, both sort of equal grammatically, and they stand side by side. They could be conjoined by and, or, but. What am I describing? I'm describing a relationship of parataxis. A compound sentence is where you have basically two clauses that are paratactically joined. And they are joined by, likely by a conjunction. All right, that would be what we could take to be a paratactic. That's what I would understand to be a paratactic conjunction of two clauses creating a compound sentence. Now, I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking in terms of compound clauses, but from my background, we haven't used that term, compound clauses. What I'd like you to be thinking in terms of whether or not it is paratactic or hypotactic. Is it extension, enhancement, projection? Which of these is it? All right. So yes, anytime you join two clauses together, that is a complex clause. Halliday, in fact, refers to it as a clause complex, as opposed to a clause simplex. A simple clause, one verb. If it is a complex clause, you've taken two clauses or more and joined them together. What defines the clause? The clause is defined by obligatory presence of a verb, the process. The process is obligatory. So please remember, when we talk about simple versus complex, what we're saying is basically that you have simple clauses, complex being that you have joined them together. So when we go back and look at these, we would have a number of clauses that, as you can see, there is nothing. All right, so 1017 is, there's no kind of relation because it's a simple clause. 1018, same. So if we went back and we looked at it, let's see, 1017, I'm optimistic about the future. That's a simple clause. Okay. 1018, I'm excited about our prospects as a nation. The use of those simple clauses is also rather noticeable, rather remarkable, all right? Because it does give it a simplicity and easy to follow. So in fact, while we have, as we've observed here, we have 17% parataxis, 82% hypotaxis. But in fact, the text is almost 50-50 simple versus complex. And so it was quite simple. And a lot of simple clauses were being used here. Well, that would have made it, well, really more easy to follow. Okay, is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, let's, section B. Section B, how should you prepare for it? This will be more conceptual, more, we could say theoretical. questions that will not be, that will be based on, and you can give examples from the texts that have been discussed in class. And as you take a look at the questions here, I'm saying illustrate with examples, illustrate with examples. Let's just take that first one. Halliday argues that the lexicographer enables the meaning-making potential in language. So, thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically, writes Halliday. Based on what you know about Halliday's approach to the study of language, systemic functional linguistics, what is meant by thinking grammatically? Illustrate your discussion with examples. I hope by now this is, if you saw a question like this, you just say, wow, that's so easy. Because it is so straightforward, all right? And I'm sorry, the questions that I'm showing you here are not the questions that you will see on your exam, all right? The point is, though, what the questions are trying to get out of you are sort of being able to show that you sort of understand the reasoning behind what we've been discussing, that you sort of can, it's not just looking at it, not just looking for patterns within texts and even comparing them in a context of situation. Yes, but at the same time, having sort of an awareness now of how language is working and why it's working the way it is. Well, it's about 7:47. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to address that first question. And I'm going to go through some slides that will do so. And then when I come back, I will also deal with the second one. I'll go through with you how I would be approaching these two questions. And we'll do that in the next hour. Okay. And again, I encourage you, ask questions. Anything that still doesn't seem quite clear as we're going through it, I hope it's all been quite digested now. So as we're getting into week 12, I hope it all makes sense. And if it doesn't, ask me. All right. And that's sort of why I'm keeping my chat here, so I can see what questions you have. So if you, the easiest way is just to give me some questions as we're going through this. Anything that we're mentioning that doesn't seem to be, you don't get it, ask. Now's the chance to do that. Okay. So it's about 7:50. Let's take 10 minutes. Let's take a break. Can I just ask, because I am coming to you from home, is everything working all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Nice and clear.
Okay. And the video clips, did those come through all right?
Yes. All good.
Okay. Not lagging?
No, no lag.
No? Good. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Okay. Good. Thank you. I'm sure you understand why I'm coming to you here rather than at school, and I hope that you understand that. Okay, so let's take that break for about 10 minutes. Come back at 8 o'clock. Okay, thank you. Just a moment. Okay, yes, confirmed. The exam is on the 12th of May, 6:30 to 8:30. It's a 2-hour exam. All right, so please take note of that. And I've been looking at my email in the break. I noticed there's several of you that are emailing me about the doing it online and indicating that you are not in Hong Kong. I will inform the department about it. Right now, I'm one point that I would like to ask if you are emailing me now about doing the exam online because you are outside Hong Kong. Would you please indicate that you did not see the email before, and that is why you are letting me know now? Because in fact, the university did say that it should be applied before the 10th of April. Now, that's why I wanted to make sure. I was a bit surprised because there were, in fact, so few of you that indicated that you wanted to do it online, and I was rather surprised by that. But I guess this, I mean, I didn't see the notice myself, as I mentioned to you. It was only after one of your classmates alerted me to it that I was aware that this notice had gone out, and I had, after that, received just a very few requests for the online. So it was I again. So I'm just looking at my phone and noticing the emails. Can I ask that you do this? If you have just emailed me now, would you please follow it up with an email to say why you haven't done so previously? Okay, just to take care of that. Now, the question that has been asked, and that is, should you be, and this was just sent from some of you to me personally, do we need to compare the Pookie text, Brandon Leaks, we've called it the Pookie text, right, with the previous spoken word performance? Certainly. And I mean, the point is that to get some idea of how you, of course, want to see how this particular spoken word performance compares with his previous one. Is there a style? Is there a way that or is it completely different in terms of use of language and patterning and so forth? You see, when I've analyzed Edwin Tumbu's poetry in the past, every time I've come across a new poem and analyzed that poem, it's always with the experience of having analyzed previous poetry that he had written. Because one notices where there are similarities, where there are differences, where I mean, his use of numbers, for example, what one might call numerology. It comes through in most of his poems. In other words, there's certain aspects of I'm able now to see more in his poetry because I'm rather more experienced with the way he writes and the kinds of techniques that he uses and how he puts his poetry together. And that's why, for example, when he gave me that poem, Uncle Never Knew, he said to me, previously, you've noticed aspects that are related to Western culture and so forth as a basis for understanding the poem. That will not be the case here. In other words, there are, it, it doesn't mean that all his poetry is the same. It's different. Each is somewhat different. So, for example, Gods Can Die, in that one, parataxis formed the background and hypotaxis the foreground. And then in the next one, David, he switched it around. Parataxis was the foreground and hypotaxis was the background. So, but it is where you cannot assume that how the patterning of one will necessarily carry over to the other, but it certainly would be something I would be paying attention to. And I would have expected in your commentary on this poem not to never see a text as an island that is somehow disconnected with other texts, especially the texts from the same author, writer, speaker. So yes, I would be very, honestly, yeah, very surprised if I read a commentary on the Pukki text that made no mention whatsoever of what was discovered and what we noticed when looking at the Puff text. Honestly, and that's what I want you to sort of get the habit of doing, and that is not just seeing texts in isolation, but seeing them in the context of the situation, yes, and within which they take place, but also intertextually within the context of other texts of similar nature. So I'm not asking you, for example, to compare Brandon Leake's Pukki text with Edwin Tumbu's poetry. No, I mean that especially within 800 words, I wouldn't expect you to do that. But what do you see anything from your experience with the poetry of Edwin Tumbu or other poets that we've looked at that you would be paying attention to here? Do you see a patterning that forms the background? Do you see a repatterning that forms the foreground? So before I go on to answering this question, it is something that I want you to really have a sense that you're building up an experience with text, and you'll begin to see sort of old formulas repeated in new texts. You'll begin to see typical kinds of patterns that again emerge, and this becomes sort of it reflects your experience, it reflects and so by this point in looking at text linguistics, and what I would like to see in your responses, whether it be on the commentary or whether it be within your exam, that you're coming to the text with an experience of other texts, with expectations, with hypotheses, because you come with a hypothesis, with an expectation of what you're looking for, what you're expecting to find. It's not like coming to every text brand new, right? Okay, I think I've maybe made that point too strongly, okay? What is important, and I've been repeating this, so we should be able to use the same theory and method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics, whatever kind of text or subtext we're trying to interpret, whether it's Tennyson or Darwin, Mother Goose, or the Scientific American. So if you ask me a question and you say, well, looking at Brandon Leake's Pukki text, are we supposed to follow the same thing that we do with other texts? Of course, yes, yes. And that's the whole point. It's to have a theory, a method of linguistic analysis. That's sort of hopefully something that you got out of this course, a way to look at it. Is it the Is that all there? I'll make this point again. Is that all there is? Transitivity, logical, theme? Is that everything? No, no, of course not. That's not the extent of what we can observe in language, in text, in terms of what kinds of patterns, because there can be other things. The use of tense, for example, we notice that too. But this is a beginning. It is a method. It is an approach that you can apply other ways of looking at the text, other kinds of linguistic analysis. But this gives you sort of a core feature of what you could be looking at in terms of being able to compare texts. We should be able to apply the same grammatics. The alternative, Halliday just dismissing it. It's a ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary. And that definitely is not what you want to be doing. And that's definitely not what your commentary should be. It should not be what you do on the exam. That should not be what you take away from this course. That is just sort of anyhow ideas about what you think the text means and why it means the way it does. No, that we wanted to have a handle on that and then be able to explain how a text is similar or different, how the Pookie text is similar or different aesthetically, functionally. What do you observe? I'm glad that some of you have asked that question, because I'd be very disappointed if I got your commentary and then notice that you didn't compare it at all with the puff text. I mean, so I'm glad that some of you have asked that question, and I hope that if you've written it so far and you thought you were done, go back and look at it, and to be thinking about what observations when Professor Webster was going through the puff text, what were kinds of things that he noticed? Is any of that here? Talk about that. So what is this theory and method of linguistic analysis? What is this grammatics that will enable us to explain what sets apart certain texts as art, for example? What gives it that aesthetic value? So what is Halliday's approach? A text is derived from a system of choices. And because it is a system of choices, it is making meaning. It is a choice of what to say and a choice what not to say. It's both. And because it is a choice, it is making meaning. You have a choice. And therefore, it makes, it is either going to be expressing meaning one way or another. And the way you choose language, whether you're representing the verb as a verb, the process as a verb, or the process as a noun, that is a choice you're making. What is meaning? Well, now this, I hope, will be fundamental to you. And this would be what you'd also take away from this idea from systemic functional linguistics, that meaning is primarily three meta functions. The ideas, the way we construe the world, that's one subcomponent of this ideational meaning. It's also how we take our ideas and we connect them up one to the other. How we expand. We don't just utter simple one clause utterances. We expand our ideas into the text. What are those interclausal semantic relations? How do we enact a social relationship? How do we use language to relate to others? That is very important when you look at, for example, Romney. How's he relating to his audience? No, he doesn't ask questions. No, he doesn't use the imperative, but it's in this case, it would be the use of a theme, the use of we, forming that relationship together. He's trying to impress you with what he will accomplish. Textual meaning. I was reading a book this past week. I was asked to review a book for a publisher who was interested in whether or not to publish this book, and I was reading it, and the author, obviously not very familiar with system and function linguistics, was looking at the meta functions and said the textual is not important. It's not significant. In fact, it's subordinate to the meta functions. Well, in a way, you could say that the ideas that you want to express, the relations that you want to express, these are core, but they are only possible. They are only made visible. They only materialize. They are meaning, but they only can really materialize through textual meaning. It's how you take and how you basically turn that invisible meaning into the visible text. And Halliday identifies just two aspects of it: theme, how you begin, and the flow of information. The three meta functions. There three are important. The three are significant. What enables this meaning making is the lexicogrammar. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. So when we talk about thinking grammatically, we're talking about the wording. What kinds of texts, what kinds of processes are taking place? Who initiates? Who's affected? These are the questions that you're asking and that you will have when you look at a text. Now, you've gotten the training in looking at a text and being able to analyze it in terms of this wording. And that's why on the exam, I've given you practice, and that has been part of what your assignments have been. You've done this, you've worked on this, and I hope that you take that sort of training away with you in terms of how you can analyze the text, in terms of the kinds of meaning, how it is realized through the wording, transitivity, logical, theme, mood, modality. I hope that what you take away that ability from having done this course. But on the exam, what I'm going to be interested in is how you, once having been given the analysis in the tables, what can you observe from it? What can you say about it? This is in a way, of course, it's the more difficult. It really reflects on it's taking data and being able to draw out observations and conclusions based on the data. And that's always honestly, yes, the more difficult task. But what you need to look at it is in terms of here, that's why we're saying you look at it in terms of patterning. Yes. What do you observe? What becomes the more frequent? By thinking grammatically, how much can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? How a text comes to be valued, both aesthetically and functionally. Maybe you remember this quote. Halliday quotes this Walker Gibson, who was writing about Tennyson. And the Walker Gibson says, I submit then that Tennyson's poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. Well, I hope that what you can say is that I submit then that Brandon Leake's poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. What does it tell you? And Hassan's approach, I definitely subscribe to the approach that she presents, and this idea that on the one hand, if we take a look at Romney's speech like we just looked at, we are looking at it sort of at the level of verbalization, his speaking. And in terms of, we're looking at the semantics, the use of lexicography, phonology, we're looking at those aspects. And granted, we haven't said much at all about phonology in this course. Our focus has been mostly on those aspects of the lexicography that we've been discussing. But the point is, yes, if we take a look at Romney, we're not really taking it to the next level. We wouldn't expect to. Because we're not expecting that what Romney, for example, in his debate performance is trying to do, we're not expecting that he's trying to be artistic. No, that wouldn't fit with a debate performance. He's not trying to be poetic. He's trying to persuade, trying to motivate people to vote for him. But if I'm looking at Brandon Leake's spoken word performance, I am going to have to take it to the next level. And what does that mean? That means looking at where is there symbolic articulation. And what does that mean? Symbolic articulation. How do you articulate the symbols? How do you take that one level, verbalization, and take it to the next level? How? You remember the phrase? Mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. I hope that is sort of ingrained in your mind right now, all right? Mobilizing, what does it mean? Taking, using the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, the ways that we typically use language, mobilizing that, taking that, and making out of it a non-habitual and unexpected consistency, a pattern, a patterning that is going to be the basis of forming the background against which you are going to repattern, the foregrounding. Is there foregrounding in the Pookie text? Is there a pattern there? How does Brandon Leake take the habitual patterns of grammatical choice and create a non-habitual consistency against which then to foreground? And on the basis of that, saying something, getting across his hypothesis, getting across his meaning, his ideas about some aspect of the life of social man. Theme. Of course, not theme in Halliday's sense. Theme here in the literary sense. This is art. This is what makes art. This is what distinguishes art from other kinds of text. That's what separates. So when someone asked me, well, are we supposed to apply the same sort of analysis like we do other texts to Brandon Leaks? Yes, of course. And that's why we've gone through all that analysis. But the purpose is to see how the artist, how the spoken word performer takes those patterns and reworks them, repatterns out of them to create a foreground, to create a second level of meaning, another level of meaning, how he is getting across what he's saying, but he's doing so aesthetically. In other words, the poetry has a function, it has a purpose. The purpose is to communicate some aspect, some hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. And then that purpose is going to be realized through art. That's what so there are, when you look at, when we say that something is verbal art, that does distinguish it from an academic text. Now, do you have scientific academic texts that are art? Well, Halliday would argue yes. You know what he wrote about Darwin's Origin of Species, that it was so phenomenal. Yes, I suppose that's the science, depending on the writer, can in fact, yes, perhaps create a kind of art, verbal art, out of the expression of science. But normally, when you pick up a textbook, when you pick up a linguistics textbook, you're not looking for the art, you're looking for the verbalization. But need to recognize there is a difference. So what did Hassan say? She says the patterns are deployed as to take us in a particular direction. Yes. Each message is a message by itself, but the totality of these messages enunciates a theme. The totality of these messages, the text. That's why when we get to talking about a text, when you do the lexicogrammatical analysis, that is at the level of clause. And yes, so you can look at each message. And when Hassan says message here, you almost could substitute the word clause. Each clause is a clause by itself, but the totality of these clauses enunciates a theme. It creates the text, and out of this text comes this second order of meaning, this theme. Out of the process of symbolic articulation, this foregrounding. And so the theme becomes accessible. How do we discover the theme? Yes, we look at each separate clause, and from that we begin to see the pattern, but then we are guided by the repatterning of those patterns, the foregrounding. And that's why we said it is an extended metaphor. The whole nature of how that text is written is creating a symbol, creating a metaphor. The text itself becomes the metaphor. Not the word, not the grammatical category, noun versus verb. No, it is the text itself becomes the metaphor. It's to be able to see that in the text. That's what I hope you begin to take away from, as this I'm concluding, as this is week 12, we have one more week, but I'm trying to get across to you what I've wanted you to learn from this semester, taking this course. What I hope you take away from it is an appreciation for how, yes, we make meaning, how a text comes to mean what it does, and how we can discover that, and how we can observe the fact that it's not, meaning is not all just literal, it's metaphorical, and we have different levels of metaphoricity, if you want to say that, lexical metaphors, grammatical metaphors, extended metaphors. So my favorite from Hassan's linguistics, language, and verbal art, which will be included, the whole book, her whole book will be included in this final volume of her collected works. And this will be volume 7, verbal art. And in that, yes, the widower in the country. And when we looked at it, that what's striking is when you read it, it just seems, yeah, on one level, it is just the boring, mundane, routine life of this widower. But in fact, there are levels of contrast here. There's a lot of doing, and those form the background against which there are other process types. The widower is the doer and throughout, but in contrast then with other participants. The repetition of the conjunction and, there's simple parataxis that occurs throughout the text, but then there are the complex clauses which combine parataxis, hypotaxis, and rank shifting. You have the future tense, which occurs almost throughout, except in contrast with other tenses. The widower is theme, grammatical theme in the systemic functional grammatical sense, Halliday sense, in contrast with other choices of theme. There is a clear, consistent use of language in mobilizing the habitual patterns, the process types of doing. The widower is the doer. The conjunction and, the future tense, the widower as the beginning of each clause. Well, yes, that forms the pattern against which there is a repatterning, the contrast that we do notice. And there's a consistency of that repatterning. And so it occurs in certain locations as we identified, and on that basis, we are drawn. We see how the poet is drawing us through language to certain words, to certain feelings, so that the aching, the darkness, the screaming, we're drawn to that because that is where we notice the foregrounding. Our attention is being forced to look at where there is this aching, this pain, this darkness, this screaming. And that's the whole point of it. The poet foregrounds, draws out your attention, and to those places in the poem where the metaphor, the symbol, what he wants to convey. This consistency of choices weaves what Professor David Butt from Macquarie University calls the poem's existential fabric. So Hassan concluded this was the theme. So I ask you then, when you look at the Pukki text, what is the theme? How, and because you do sort of have to begin with a hypothesis about what it is that Brandon Leake was trying to do in that poem. And then how did his language draw you to this? A literary artifact is an extended metaphor. Question that someone asked, two orders of meaning only applies to literary pieces. Well, in a way, it is what let me put it this way, it's what defines art, verbal art. As I said, one might argue that Darwin's Origin of Species. One might argue that the Psalms in the Bible, that these are art. They're verbal art. They're not just an expression of science. They're not just an expression of theology. They are art. Yes, because the writer here had an idea in mind that wanted to get across. So can science be verbal art? Yes, it can be. But to say that means that there was something about the writer's use of language that created a particular aesthetic value that made it art. And what makes it art is the fact that there is, it's not just the art for art's sake. It's art to say something, to get across the meaning in a special way, to make an impact through language. So if you ask me, so two orders of meaning only applies to literary pieces, what I would change that question to be two orders of meaning defines verbal art. And verbal art can be in a poem. It can be in what we would consider to be literary, but it can also be in what we would consider to be science, what we would consider to be theology. What we might even consider to be political discourse. But what we'd be saying would then be that there is something beyond. There is a level of meaning, a verbalization, which, and the writer has taken it to another level, a deeper meaning that is not there on the surface. Just like the poem that we just were looking at, it on one level is just this widower's boring life, but it was what Hassan would argue. There was a theme there, the essence of humanity. To be human, to be an individual, you need to be with others. What makes human existence sane, what protects it from the nightmarish chimera is another's company. There was a meaning, another level of meaning beyond the literal. It is the metaphorical. Okay. Second question was, again, I know you're not going to get the same questions, but as we're going through this, and as I'm answering these questions, it will be helpful to you in terms of hopefully consolidating what we have been thinking about. And that's why I'm going through these, all right? The history of scientific discourses reveals new ways of making meaning in language for new ways of thinking. Professor David Butt, in his article, Disciplinary English, The Knight's Move in Halliday's Theories of Verbal Science and Verbal Art, describes this new way of making meaning in scientific discourse as a grammatical drift that creates a novel intensity in the way writers in English can construe experience. What is the nature of this grammatical drift to which Butt refers? Illustrate your discussion with examples. The history of scientific discourse reveals new strategies evolving, new ways of organizing grammar as a resource for making meaning. You see, I don't know how you feel about it, but what's always fascinated me, whether it was Ruqaiya Hassan looking at poetry or Halliday looking at the language of science, it was to be able to realize that there is indeed innovation in language. There's creativity in language. That there is, that one is expanding the domains of meaning. That we are in fact, language is so much more than just looking at whether a sentence is grammatical or not. There's so much more going on. So what were these new strategies? And the point being, what Halliday is saying is that there were pre-existing resources. Basically, innovation in language is taking what's there already and moving forward beyond that, taking, as he puts it, the use of pre-existing resources to create a discourse that moves forward by logical, coherent steps, each building on what has gone before. So he talks about the fact that when we're talking about the English language, we're looking back at the early Greeks and what they accomplished. They had transcategorization, something we call derivational morphology. Verbs and adjectives were transformed into nouns. They had the ability to post-modify the nominal group, extending the nominal group with embedded clauses, prepositional phrases. Looking at optics, Halliday goes through and he identifies the fact that in this great work, there were descriptions of experiments, very much, sort of the way we use language, not with grammatical metaphor. Lots of clause complexes, a lot of action, okay? The steps of what you did, how you carried out the experiment. So is doing. Then on the basis of those experiments, then there were arguments, conclusions. Now here you'd begin to see more nominalizations, what we'd call grammatical metaphor, because it's the results. But then finally, in terms of sort of the mathematical formulations, basically taking what were complex clauses and reducing that to a simple clause. Typically, A equals X. What does that mean? That means A is this lexically dense nominal group, noun phrase. B or X, is this another lexically dense nominal group. And then using some verb, relational process, to relate these two together. So what you end up with is a simple clause. And so it's basically this kind of formula, and that's what we begin to see is the language of science. So Halliday's point is that by the end of the 18th century, began to see that the way we understood the world, the experience of the world, was highly nominalized. And what's the verb then used for? The verb indicates the relationship between these happenings that have been turned into something. So A causes X, or A proves X. A and X being nominal groups. And this then is what has emerged as the way in which we talk about and write about science. Well, you can see it illustrated here. In this example I've given you before, So what we're saying is you begin with the clausal. That is the sort of the, like how Sir Isaac Newton talked about experiments, all right? So you have a clause, they educated girls. It's related by a conjunction to another clause, women acquired the vote. And so we'd say that's a complex clause. Now, the nominalized form, the metaphorical, the incongruent, those clauses have become noun phrases, the education of girls. Women acquire the vote becomes the acquisition of the vote by women. Notice all the post-modification of the vote by women. And so we have two lexically dense nominal groups describing an event that's been turned into a thing. And then where's the verb? The verb is preceded, which is showing the relationship between these two events, turning happenings into something. And the verb now becomes a way to relate them. It takes the place of what had been used by a conjunction. And so there's then this shift. The verbs and the adjectives become nouns. The conjunctions are turning into verbs. And what were complex clauses now become simple clauses. And what were clauses before become noun phrases. There's a shift downwards. There's a shift sideways. All of these shifts that are taking place in the language, now they occur with such intensity that they become the way one writes for science. The shift becomes the drift. It's that direction. That's the direction that science, the language of academic discourse, has taken. The instances become the system. Now this is important because when we talk about the instance, we're talking about the text. When we talk about the system, we're talking about what is that system of language? It is the way we speak language. It is that abstraction. Langue, as Saussure talked about, think of it as language with a capital L. It is the system of language. It's that abstraction. It is meaning potential. How do you understand what is the system of language? You can only understand it through the instances of language, through the text. And that's the point of what we do here. You cannot really get at language without going first through the text. The text is the way that we can understand what is and how language works. Halliday's analyses of scientific discourse reveal a broad form of grammatical drift. It's the way language is changing, language is evolving. It creates a novel intensity. It is repeated so many times that it becomes the way that it becomes the language of science. It becomes the register. And this has an impact on the way we see the world. Things are foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, relations. Our language itself shapes the way we think. If all the time the way we construe the world is in terms of things, that's how we think. Now, what we've been talking about is that when you're starting out to talk, and the child is talking, the mother tongue and so forth, things are nouns, qualities are adjectives, processes are verbs. That's the default, right? It is the congruent. It is the automatic. And we have what we saw before, the instances of language become the system of language. And this system, things are nouns, but we, as we saw, we can redraw that. Now, remember what Halliday was saying, that what was the purpose? Why do this? Why turn happenings into something? It is to show the progression of ideas. Yes, you talk about all the actions that are taking place here. The solvent is drawn through the membrane into the solution, thus diluting it. Just when, like Sir Isaac Newton talking about the experiments. And then need a way to package that so that we can now talk about it and make some observation about what has taken place here. We can make some conclusion. And to do that, we need to sort of repackage that dynamic happening into a static something. Movement of the solvent across the membrane. Now we can talk about it. It becomes the grammatical subject, becomes the theme of the next clause. It's what we're talking about now. And that's one of the reasons why we ended up having this occur, this normalization. Basically, it was, and that's why as Halliday traces it and looks back at Sir Isaac Newton's, I mean, you have the experiments that are all spoken in rather clausal means, and then the conclusions, and then subsequently, then the theory itself is all expressed in terms of these sort of A equals X. And what is this? Of course, it is grammatical metaphor. It becomes the means to innovate in language. It's just like traditional metaphor, the level of words. That's why what we've seen in this course has been to look at lexical metaphor, grammatical metaphor, extended metaphor. And in so doing, yes, it has given enormous power. As this is what Halliday writes, this nominalizing grammar has given scientists enormous power over their environment, so much so they can make the world stand still. Turn the dynamic verb into a static noun. Create new virtual realities. It's the power of language. I think I've shared with you before that Halliday one time wrote me a letter, and in the letter he mentioned 7 distinctive features of SFL. What were those 7 distinctive features? Quantitative studies and probability. Yeah, he's very interested in corpus linguistics and looking at the probabilities, because the probabilities, the instances define the system. Metafunction, obviously. Historical context of linguistics. By that he meant looking at how linguistics itself, the discipline, has been shaped by developments in terms of the way we understand the world of science. Marxism. Halliday was a Marxist. That's one of the reasons why, and I think I've shared this with you before, when he was in the UK, he was teaching in the university in UK, and he planned to go to Canada, Vancouver University, British Columbia, and he was offered a position there, and he packed up everything, left his job, and then when he wanted to go and enter Canada, he was turned away. Why? because of his Marxism. He could not enter Canada at that time, all right? And so that's why when he then spent 2 years looking at the language of their infant son and looking at how the development of language in the child, that's how he had so much time, those 2 years. And this was before then he went on to Sydney and became the founding professor of the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sydney. But in that span of time, I mean, basically he was out of work. Ruqayya Hassan found a job in California, and Halliday looked after their infant son and took that opportunity to note down everything that their infant son said, and on the basis of that looked at the language development of the child. Halliday, as I mentioned, he studied in China for his undergraduate, and that's why in many cases the way that he approaches language has been very much influenced by some of China's most well-known linguists. And when he went on then to do his PhD, and he went back to the UK, and he wanted to study under his mentor, J.R. Firth. I mentioned his name before. And J.R. Firth was at Oxford, and Halliday went for the interview to enter Oxford. And he was asked at the interview, do you belong to the Communist Party? And Halliday refused to answer. So he was not admitted to Oxford. He could not study under his mentor, it seemed. And instead, he was accepted to Cambridge. At Cambridge, they only studied literature, not linguistics. There was no linguistics at that time at Cambridge. So Halliday took a literary text, Secret History of the Mongols, a Chinese text, and did his PhD on the linguistic analysis of this literary text. So it is interesting to look at the background and to notice and observe how one's background does contribute to one's looking at language. Just quickly, the other three, unity of lexis and grammar, that's why it's always lexicogrammatically. He doesn't see it as a distinction, words and grammar. They are all really one phenomena, but it's sort of different ends. Just like he says, you can find a dictionary and you can find a grammar book. Now, the point is they're both language. They're both about language, but at different ends. The one more oriented to lexis, the other to grammar. But what Halliday was seeing is it's more of a unity. It's a continuum. The continuity of proto-language, meaning that what he observed in the way how his infant son was using language, we are a product of our history. We're a product of our history in the development of language. And finally, patterns of analogies, complementarities in language. Well, I think that it's 9 o'clock. And I think probably a good point now to take a break. So let's take a break for about 10 minutes, okay? And let's come back at 10 after 9. Okay, let's take a break. Okay, so let's continue. What I wanted to introduce this for was because I do think to understand the way we approach language and look at language, it's important to look at what is the background. What do we bring to our academic pursuit? So that when Halliday lists these 7 distinctive features, the one that he mentions, Marxism. Now, what does it mean? That is Marxism a part of SFL? Is it, would you say that to be in SFL, you need to be a Marxist? No, definitely not. And Halliday would say that, says that himself. Halliday, in an interview, because for a number of years, he didn't talk about this particular topic, Marxism and the influence that it had on his linguistics. And part of that was due to what he encountered when he, for example, what I explained to you about his at first wanting to getting the job in Canada and then being turned away. Halliday, in an interview, this was with Professor Hassan, Jim Martin, Gunter Kress, was asked about his views, and he said this now with Firth. Now, you remember Firth was the one in Oxford and, well, in fact, at SOAS, and he wanted to study under Firth. And even though he ended up at Cambridge, still he was allowed to study under Firth. Though officially at Cambridge, he was able to go back and forth and to have the advantage of being able to study with Firth. Now, he says this, with Firth, you see, it's very interesting because Firth was right at the other end of the political spectrum. He's conservative. There was, in fact, an interesting occasion when I went to be interviewed by him for a job at SOAS. It was after this interview, in fact, that Firth said, of course, you'd label me a bourgeois linguist. And I said, this is Halliday, I think you're a Marxist. And he laughed at me. It seemed to me, this is Halliday speaking, that in fact the ways in which Firth was looking at language, putting it in its social context, were in no way in conflict with what seemed to me to be a political approach. So that it seemed to me that in taking what I did from Firth, I was not separating the linguistic from the political. It seemed to me rather that most of his thinking was such that I could see it perfectly compatible with, indeed, a rather necessary step towards what I understand as a Marxist linguistics. Halliday continues, I do not see my linguistics and politics as separate. I see them as very closely related. To me, it's very much part of this backing off movement. In other words, I started off when I got back to Cambridge being very politically active and trying to combine the role of being a graduate student in linguistics with being active in the local Communist Party, setting up Britain-China Friendship Association and all that. But even then, there were only 24 hours in the day, and the two came to clash. I had to decide which I was better at. And I thought, well, I don't know. Probably there are more people who can do the political spade work. But there's a more important point than that. What worried me at the time was the search for a Marxist linguistics. It seemed to me that any attempts to think politically about language and develop a Marxist linguistics were far too crude. They involved almost closing your eyes to what you actually knew about language in order to say things. My feeling was we should not. Of course, the cost of doing this is that you may have to cease to be a Marxist, at least in a sense in which anyone would recognize you as one, in order to go away for 50 years and to really do some work and do some thinking. You're not really abandoning the political perspective. You're simply saying that in order to think politically about something as complicated as language, you've got to take a lot longer. You got to do a lot of work. You got to run the risk of forgetting that what you're doing is political. Because if you force that too much to the forefront, your work will always remain at the surface. It will always be something for which you expect to have an immediate application in terms of struggle. You can't do that in the long run. You're going to pay the price that you may achieve something that's going to be useful for 2 weeks or 2 years, then it'll be forgotten. I always wanted to see what I was going towards as, in the long run, a Marxist linguistics, towards working on language in the political context. But I felt that in order to do that, you really had to back off and go far more deeply into the nature of language. Okay, so then what was particularly Marxist about Halliday's conception of language? Well, of course, the idea of language and consciousness originate in the social nature of human activity. Marnie Halborough in The Politics of English, she writes this: Marx makes it clear that the development of consciousness and therefore language was evolutionary. Language and consciousness evolve continuously over time, and this is a way that Halliday sees language. The evolutionary aspect of language and consciousness parallel the evolution of human society itself.
What I'm getting at is this: if you're particularly talking about study of language in Marxist terms, then you've got to look at it in relation to the society of which it comes from, essentially. So, what is the what were the views of language that were then current in a non-Marxist, non-Marxist society, in our kind of society, right? And I think that the way to look at it is this: that in language studies and linguistics generally, there were certain priorities, and I'm going to look at my list of these. Right, there was standard languages were privileged or prioritized over dialects, written languages over spoken, classical languages over modern ones, formal language over colloquial, dominant languages over emergent ones, literary language over everyday language, majority languages over minority languages. Now, that was always clear. Nowadays, of course, we would add things looking back and say things like, well, it prioritized ideational meaning over interpersonal and so on. Okay. So, now these are not clear-cut categories, and I'm certainly not saying that there was no work done under these the other headings. So there was lots of work in dialectology, there was work on minority languages and so on. But the view of language which was predominant was essentially that derived from all those highly valued forms of language rather than the others. So we wanted to really unpack that, examine it, and in the context in which we were working, which is the 1950s, we spent a lot of time, for example, on emerging on languages of ex-colonial societies which were struggling to gain their own status as national languages, like Swahili, like Yoruba, and so on. So that just was one particular way in which we, as it were, tried to put these notions into practice as to where the mainstream linguistics had actually come from. Which is not to say that you reject all its things at all, but you know, if you then reflect on the way that we represented grammar, for example, and all other features of language. You see that background there, where the ideas come from. So we wanted to give value to these forms of language which were, what was that nice phrase that somebody brought up in the 70s, of socially induced low visibility? I love that phrase.
Yes.
Forms of language of socially induced low visibility.
Yes.
Okay. So that, in a sense, is the background. Now, all I would say is that in my own background at that time, my own thinking at that time, I would say, yes, I was very definitely trying to adopt what I would consider a Marxist approach, and indeed I still would. But the problem is that so many people will have different interpretations of what that means. Certainly doesn't commit anyone who does systemic functional linguistics to working to be a left wing in politics or anything of that kind. But that was part of the background, at least particularly in my own thinking. And so in that sense, I'm not at all saying Marxist means, as it were, there, even in embryo, in the words and the works of Marx himself. Much more in the sense of the ideology, if you like. Now, yes, in a sense that does, I don't think one can help this, that one's personal ideology, as it were, is going to affect one's work in science. Even if that ideology, so to speak, is precisely to say, well, you shouldn't let it. But even that is an ideological position, if you're going it.
Halliday says this: in order to study language in Marxist terms, one must look at it in relation to the society which it comes from. Now, the point that Halliday is making is that, so what impact did this have when they formed this Marxist study group on language, when he got to Cambridge and so forth? What influence did it have? By the way, that interview was I conducted with David Butt and Annabelle Lukin, both of whom are at Macquarie University, and they and I were interviewing Professor Halliday and Professor Hassan. It was in their living room, and it was not soundproof, and it was in Sydney, and that's why you can hear the thunder and the rain and so forth. I should have probably warned you about that thunder. In any case, without being distracted by that. Halliday's saying, what were the views of language that were current in a non-Marxist society? Now, the point was that what they were saying was that what was linguistics? Linguistics basically was looking at language from a very narrow point of view. It was focused on the priorities were standard languages, standard English, all these standard languages, written varieties, classical, formal, dominant, literary, majority. And the focus on meaning was ideational meaning. So what they were questioning was whether or not, in fact, there should, in fact, be a recognition that there are, other than standard language, there are dialects, there's spoken language, there's colloquial varieties, there's minority languages, there's interpersonal meaning. And so the point was that they had to sort of expand and wanted to see what were other aspects of language. Then to really have an idea of language, one needed to expand one's ideas. And so what Halliday was saying in my own background, he said my own thinking at that time was trying to adopt, yes, this Marxist approach. And indeed, as he said, he still would. But is basically looking at language from a critical perspective, to saying that the way linguistics was looking at language was too narrow, that it had to expand its perspective to get a real view of what was going on in language. And then he says this about I don't think one can help that one's personal ideology is going to affect one's work in science. Even if that ideology, so to speak, is to say, well, you shouldn't let it, but even that, as he said, is an ideological position. The way one sees the world is going to affect the way you see whatever it is you're working with from the perspective of science. It's never going to be completely without any sense of personal ideology. You cannot avoid that. So Halliday, yes, was brought to his perspective on language an ideological position that was political, it was Marxist. As he says, though, to do SFL doesn't necessarily mean one needs to be in left-wing politics, needs to be a Marxist. I'm not a Marxist. But what I do appreciate about Halliday's approach is the realization that what we do need to focus on is how we can apply the knowledge that we get about language to solving real world problems. This whole emphasis on applicability, being able to apply what we learn, to being able to say something about not just why a text comes to mean what it does, but how it comes to be valued as it is. What Halliday says finally is, if Marxist thinking means anything, it simply means clear and honest and objective thinking about, first of all, whatever it is that you're focusing your attention on. Now, from that standpoint, that, yes, I think we all can subscribe to that point of view. Politics aside, we want clear and honest and objective thinking. He goes on to say, it is then that which indirectly many steps away is going to have, we hope in the long run, some sort of effect. What he's saying here is that if we have clear, honest, objective thinking about language, in the end, it's going to have an impact. It will have an impact on society. It will have some sort of effect. He saw it from a Marxist political point of view. But you can also see the advantage of being able to look at language with a perspective that it should have some impact on the society that is being studied for good. And that's why his emphasis on applicable linguistics. I believe I've given you this quote before, but let me read it again. I use applicable because applied linguistics has come to function in some kind of opposition to linguistics, meaning linguistics proper or theoretical linguistics. This is, you see, the sad part of linguistics is that when you say applied linguistics, it means like just related to teaching language. It is as though it is not true linguistics, not real linguistics. As though there is sort of this, opposition. Applied linguistics is here and real linguistics is here. Wrong. I'd say yes, wrong. Because the point is that, and this is what Halliday is going on to say, why do we reject that opposition? We need some way to unify those two. We need some way to say that we are finding out something about language, but we are also able to apply it. And what he's saying is, in fact, that only through the application of what we learn can our theory grow. Can our understanding of language, the system of language, can it grow? I want a general term, Halliday says, which gives the sense of something that is capable of having evolved in the context of being applied. It is the nature of language, that by looking at the application, what we are actually doing is we are developing the theory. Our knowledge of what language is and how it works, how it functions, is advanced. Halliday said he didn't want something that lasted, a short period of time. And, I am the editor of his collected works. And his works go back to the 1950s. And you think about that, that's, 70 some years ago. And I remember when I began working on Halliday's collected works, at the time, the dean of the faculty said, "Why on earth are you doing that? It's old stuff." But that's what honestly impressed me the most. When I look at linguists like Chomsky and what they wrote in the 1950s, it is completely, truly irrelevant. I mean, Chomsky, by his own admission, would not pay any attention at all to what he wrote back in the 50s. But for Halliday, no. It has a what I would call a shelf life. It has no expiry date. What Halliday was writing back in the 50s and 60s and 70s and onwards still has a relevance today. And that, to me, is the kind of linguistics that I want to do. I want to do a kind of linguistics that isn't going to be, after a year or two, out of date and no use. I feel, what's the point? If what I'm writing now and if what I'm doing now in 2 years' time will be absolutely worthless, and no one will care and no one will bother with it, why do I bother? I want something that has a lasting value. And I see that in Halliday's approach to language, because he is really getting at insight about how language works. Is it growing, expanding? Yes, the theory is expanding. It's not to say that what Halliday wrote in the 50s, that was it. Even his own writing was changing. I mean, his ideas were changing. His ideas were evolving and developing. But it's not to say that what was written, and that's why it gave me a great pleasure to be the editor for his collected works, because what he was writing had a relevance, had a significance, even today. You see, applicability, what it does, it tests the robustness of the theory. It's like a test. How robust, how strong is your theoretical framework? Can it stand up to actually the application of it? Does the theory enable one to answer questions about how language means, how language is valued in actual use? That's the questions that I've been asking and that I hope you're asking. And I hope you're getting answers to those. And what does language show us? You see, we don't just simply ask, is a sentence grammatical, and based on that, try to draw out some view on how language works. And that's what you find very often in some theories of linguistics. Just let's test it by asking, is that sentence grammatical? If it's not, then our theory has to change to accommodate that, and so forth. Instead, we're interested in what? We're interested in how language works in the context of situation. And what is the function of language? That is determined by how users respond. That is very empirical. What is function? Function, from the response of those that are hearing it and responding to it. All right, now I've given you another sort of practice, and this practice I also put into the folders and so forth, and I would like you to take this particular text, and we're interested in how to see this particular text. What would you be able to say about it? And so it's the conclusion of this commencement address that was given by Susan Rice. And you remember we talked about Susan Rice at the beginning of the semester. We compared her speaking with Donald Jung, and this is the final conclusion of her commencement address.
And finally, as you're changing the world, never neglect family. They're not just your foundation. They're the source of life's greatest fulfillment, as all the parents here can testify. Both my parents were recently struck by serious illnesses. My colleagues were tremendous about stepping in for me at the halls of the United Nations. But nobody could step in for me or my brother at the hospital. There's usually someone else who can do your job, but there's nobody else who can be a loving child or a devoted parent. Like those before you, your generation will contribute. It will innovate, and it will serve in unique ways. But today, change is coming faster than ever, and you must shape that change. You can be that change, not for an election, but for a lifetime. If you remember nothing else of what I said, try to remember that little boy. Remember that he is somebody's beloved son. Remember that he counts as much as any of us. Remember that we cannot afford to sleep easy while he suffers. Remember that you can make his life better. Above all, remember that each of us has a profound responsibility to try with all of our skill, all of our smarts, and all of our soul. So make him safe, make progress, and make us proud. Congratulations again, and Godspeed.
Okay, so that is the conclusion to her address. Now, when you approach this text, how are you going to approach it? What's the context? The context is, of course, that it is a commencement address. Now, have you come across commencement addresses before? Yes. Most notably, we looked at two commencement addresses, both of which were considered good enough to be included in the top 10 commencement speeches for Time magazine. We've looked at David Foster Wallace and Steve Jobs. We looked at Steve Jobs' commencement address. The main thing now is you're looking at what is the purpose of the commencement address. The commencement address is supposed to be, it's motivational. Who's your audience? The audience are graduates. And what is your role? Your role is to be, as the speaker, as one giving it, is you are a success story, and you are supposed to be passing along what is the secret to your success to these graduates? Remember Steve Jobs' commencement speech. There were certain aspects of it that stood out as being, typical of sort of eloquent, crafted speeches. I mean, we've seen the rule of three. We've seen it in Obama's speaking. We see things repeated 3 times. And I've gone through these patterns with you. This was very clearly, this is typical. So you'd ask yourself, do you see the rule of three? Do you see things repeated 3 times in Susan Rice's? There are figures of speech. There was antithesis or antithesis, the juxtaposition of contrasting words, often in a parallel kind of structure. So looking at this text then, do you see any sort of use of language which is what you'd consider special about Susan Rice's? Now, Susan Rice's is not listed in the top 10. Now, what else could you say about Steve Jobs? There were 3 stories, his personal stories here. Now, of course, we're not looking at the whole text for Susan Rice. We're looking at only part of it. But there is sort of this personal part of it. And we see it at the beginning of even her closing, talking about her parents and so forth. Now, it's about 9:42. I want to also go on to, again, also compare with David Foster Wallace, but I think I'm going to stop here. The point I'd like you to sort of, in thinking more about Susan Rice's commencement speech, go back and look at what we've said about Steve Jobs, look at what we've said about David Foster Wallace, and think about your analysis of her text from that standpoint of looking at it in comparison with what you know, what you expect of commencement speeches, and what you observe in her commencement speech as fitting that context of situation. And so that's where we'll pick it up next week. Next week will be, again, we'll be sort of, there's another example that I've also given you, which is a poem, one of Edwin Tumbu's poems, and I put that in also another folder with the analyses. And I've also there put the chapter from my book in which I wrote about the analysis of that particular poem. And so I would ask you to take a look at not only the Susan Rice example, but the other poem, Is Kandar, from Edwin Tumbu. Look at the analyses, look at my discussion of it. And what I'd like you to be thinking about between now and next week are any questions that you have and anything that you feel sort of unsure about that you'd like to ask me to go into more detail, to elaborate, and to respond to. Okay, so be thinking about that. Next week will be our last week together, and in the meantime, I hope that your commentary, I'm looking forward to reading them, and I hope that you can really make some very interesting observations about Brandon Leake's performance. Okay, we'll stop there, and I'll see you next week. Okay, so if you do have any questions, please do feel free to let me know. Okay, so good night.
Sorry, Professor Webster, can I ask a question?
Sure.
The text analysis that we practiced so far was a...
Just a moment. I'm sorry. I clicked on this and just
Okay.
was, and let me get my headphone in so I can hear you better. Okay. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Okay, so the text analysis that we have practiced so far was about a long text, right? So how about for some short text such as feedback as some separate sentences? Because it is difficult to see it as a long content. So if we would like to analyze some separate sentences, can we like just analyze its transitivity, tense, process types like this?
Yes. When you say short text, what do you mean?
For example, like the feedback in a corpus that the teachers give feedbacks to students draft.
Oh, okay. So certainly, I mean, in that sense, what you might be interested in, though, would be if I were looking at a teacher's feedback, right? It wouldn't be just the because the feedback would probably be something that would be continuous. So the feedback would be, even though there would be, it'd be sort of like an exchange where the teacher would be giving a response, and then the student might take some action, respond, but then there would be a follow-up to it. So the text would be the exchange between the teacher and the student, which likely wouldn't be just simple one-off clauses, right? But would be a sequence, a series of clauses that might be part of an extended exchange. So in that, you're interested, what you'd be looking for would be the patterning that would be existing across that exchange. What kind of feedback would be given? Now, each of those utterances would be clauses that you can analyze in terms of transitivity or theme or whatever. But when you're looking for the pattern, then it's going to be beyond one clause to the totality of clauses that make up that exchange. So in a teacher-student kind of exchange, there would probably be the teacher's utterances there would be a number of them, wouldn't there be?
Yeah, I think
So
maybe like so probably like one teacher feedback and one student's revision, and then another teacher's feedback that they complete a text together.
So in that sense, what you'd be looking at would be what would be the teacher's typical feedback. So in that sense, you're sort of the pattern that you'd be looking at would be, and hopefully this would be like, I mean, if you were looking at what is sort of, because always the question is not just, we're not just looking at the individual clauses.
Yes.
Right? We're looking at how those clauses combine into a text. Now, the text itself may be what occurs over a series of dialogue exchanges between the teacher and the student.
I see.
Now, am I answering your question or not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it is pretty clear. Yeah, but I'm wondering that, for example, if we see that one teacher and one student as an exchange, so it is like a case study, right? So just for one teacher's feedback, but we cannot like generalize this into the feedback itself.
True. It is would be that one. It would be if you have just one teacher and one student, but unlikely if you're doing a study, would it be limited to just that one-off exchange, right? Most likely you have your data, your corpus would be including a number of such exchanges that are occurring. So you would have sort of a a collection of dialogue that would be taking place that would make up your whole text. So you're describing then what is the teacher's response? How is the teacher's response to the student? Now, is there more than one teacher?
Yeah, there are more than one teachers. I'm guessing whether it is possible to look at like different dialogues and try to find their similarities,
Yeah.
and then to generalize what are some characteristics of
Now
the effective feedback.
You see, now that would be possible if the teachers that are responding have been trained in a particular way how to respond. So even though it's different individuals, still they sort of come from a similar training that they are sort of following a particular approach in terms of how to reply to the student. Because otherwise, yes, it may be very individualistic in terms of how they are responding, because they all come from different backgrounds and different approaches to how they respond to the student. So that would not be probably an ideal kind of case study. What you'd want would be one where your teachers are probably they are working under some rubric. They share a particular rubric that they are supposed to be following, or they have been trained in a particular way in how they're supposed to respond. So what you're able to get then out of that is not just the individuals, but how that sort of training, how that rubric has been sort of realized in terms of the individual teacher's responses. Now that would, I think, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, if the teachers are trained in a particularly same way, or they're under the same rubric, it is kind of like a controls variables that we can see the difference. I see. Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's pretty clear to me. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Can be by chat or by or spoken if you wish to say something. Anybody? Anything else? Okay, I don't hear anything, so I assume that no one is speaking. So I think with that we'll stop, and I'll say good night and see you next week. Okay, do let me know if you have questions in the meantime. Okay. Okay, good night.
Good night.